Okay, this is part 4 of Quotes by Voltaire, the great French philosopher who was also a total jerk. Cultivate your garden, and that comes from Candide. And what he's basically saying is, you can't change the whole world, but what you can do is just try to be good to the people who are around you. Be nice to the people, your friends, family, co-workers, and the people you interact with. And that makes the world a place if everybody does that. So that's really an indirect repeat of what Christ had said. If you're just good to the people around you, that ripples outward, and then everybody's better off. Okay, the next thing, it's like the golden rule: that which you do unto the least of my brethren, you do unto me. Love thy neighbor. Okay, next thing, Voltaire: the most important decision you can make is to be in a good mood. I do not agree with the words that you say, but I will defend to death your right to say them. Okay, free speech. He says, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. That is true. And Hannah Arendt had said the same thing, the banality of evil. Most evil is done by sort of average people who are just under the mindset of a bad political philosophy. Okay, you look what the people said in the 1930s about all the terrible things they did. I was just following orders. Okay. And they've shown that, like in the Stanley Milgram experiments, prison experience, and whatnot too, if people accept a cruel authority, they will do bad things. They won't even think about it. They'll just say it was their job. Look what they do to children in the public schools nowadays. They, CAS, straight them, okay? Not good. Okay, Voltaire continues. I have made only one prayer to God. O Lord, make my enemies ridiculous, and he has granted it. Common sense is not so common. Perfect is the enemy of good. I have chosen to be happy because it is good for my health. Who is the greatest man, Caesar, Alexander, or Cromwell? No, it was Newton, for he masters our minds by the force of truth, and for that we owe him reverence, not those who enslave us by violence. Okay, the next quote from Voltaire is, by the way, Cromwell's like one of the biggest jerks who ever lived. He was so awful to the Irish. If you're Irish, you automatically hate Cromwell. Okay, Voltaire. Think how difficult it is to change yourself, and you will realize how much more difficult it is to change someone else. Now, here's one of his best ones. It is difficult to free fools from the chains they love. Yeah, I see tons and tons of people, hypertensive, diabetic, coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis, AFib, cognitive decline, and they don't, I'd say, maybe 5%, it's really less than that. 5% at the most are willing to change their diet and get their act together. They all want drugs and surgeries that don't work. And they usually have terrible outcomes. Most people don't age well. Okay, Voltaire continues. Doctors are men who prescribe medicine of which they know little, to cure diseases of which they know less, for human beings of whom they know nothing. Systems of metaphysics are for philosophers what novels are for women. The body of an athlete and the soul of a sage, that is what we require to be happy. Okay, that sounds a little bit like Plato. Plato said it's not enough to be a scholar, you should also be athletic. Okay, Voltaire continues. It is not enough to see and to know the beauty of a work. We must feel and be affected by it. Now that's a good quote. That a good writer doesn't just express themselves clearly. They engage the reader and elicit emotion. Okay, that's what makes something good. When you remember a book and say you liked it, it's because it had an emotional impact on you, like a philosophical and emotional. Look at the book Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, okay? And Scrooge says, I will be good. I will celebrate Christmas the way it should be. And he brings joy not only to himself, but to everyone else, like Bob Cratchit and Tiny Tim Survives, etc. Okay, so the next quote about Voltaire about writing. One must learn to seduce. And so what he's saying there is, again, think how you talk to your friends. You don't just try to communicate clearly with your friend. You try to make your friend laugh. You try to surprise your friend. And when you write or give a YouTube presentation, you should be doing the same thing. Try to make it fun. When you write, you should be writing like you're talking to an intelligent friend. Okay, and in the long run, that's the only person who's going to pay attention to your work anyway. So somebody who kind of likes where you're coming from, okay? So there's no point in writing to stupid people because they don't read. There's no point in writing the style of people who don't like you because they're never going to like you no matter what you do. So just write to the kind of people who would probably like you because they're the ones who are going to probably like you. Okay, Voltaire, woe to the author determined to teach. The best way to be boring is to leave nothing out. Yeah, and that's like the Oscar Wilde quote. If you exhaust the subject, you exhaust the listener or exhaust the reader. Voltaire, the secret of being a bore is to tell everything. Yeah, a good teacher should just give them enough that they get the main idea and they're interested to learn more on their own. But, you got to be careful not to overdo it. Voltaire, writing is the painting of the voice. It is not enough to conquer. One must learn to seduce. And then an aristocrat was giving him a hard time about how he had sort of made up his own name to make himself sound like more of an aristocrat. And so when the aristocrat gave him a hard time, Voltaire replied, "My name begins with me, yours ends with you. Better to honor a new name than to dishonor an old one." Voltaire, think for yourself and let others enjoy the privilege of doing so. So, obviously he's real clever. He's got a lot of good lines. Okay, let's see here. The next quote by Voltaire. A man who persecutes another man because he is not of the same opinion is a monster. That happens all the time. Skepticism is the foundation of all wisdom. Cherish those who seek the truth, but beware of those who claim to find it. If God did not exist, we would have to invent him. I want my doctor and my tailor to believe in God so they do not rob me. Better to give oneself a new name than to disgrace an old one. That's another translation of the one we just did up above. The man who writes a contemporary history must expect to be criticized for everything he says and for everything he does not say. Yeah, Voltaire also wrote some histories in addition to all the plays he wrote. Okay, and then he said, life resembles the banquet of Damocles. The sword is never suspended. So Damocles was like about the king who had a servant named Damocles. Damocles had wanted to see what it would be like to be king. But when the real king let him be king for a little while, he was always afraid that, that people were going to come after him and stuff. That's the sword of Damocles. So if you don't eat a low-fat vegan diet, you're always at risk to have a heart attack. Or something close to it. You don't have to eat 100% vegan, but like 90% or more at least. Okay, self-love is the instrument of our preservation. It is necessary. It gives us pleasure, but we must conceal it. Yeah, you need self-esteem. Thomas Shaw said that. Self-esteem is the engine that we run on. So a person needs self-esteem in order to develop. Voltaire, fools admire everything in a respected author. Yeah, all you have to do is tell people an author is respected, and they get interviewed all over the place, their books sell well, but they almost always stink. And the reason they almost always stink is because the publishing companies will only publish stuff that stinks. They don't let smart macho men get published in mainstream publishing anymore. They don't let smart mainstream macho men get shown on mainstream TV or mainstream movies. And that's why noble masculinity has pretty much disappeared from the public sphere. But noble masculinity is what produced most of the best books and movies and TV shows. So that's why most books, movies, and TV shows, they all stink nowadays. Okay, and even the ones that have stuff for kids. Look at Walt Disney back in the 1930s. It was magnificent. Those old cartoons, like Snow White, Pinocchio, and other ones. Whereas nowadays they all stink. Okay, here's from Voltaire's book. Oh, he says, well, first of all, one last quote. By appreciation, we make excellence and others our own property. And now from the book Candide. Candide asks the other author, how many plays do you have in France? And the abbé says 5,000 or 6,000. Candide says, that's a lot. Candide, how many are good? The abbé says, about 15 or 16. And then the other person, I think Martin, the philosopher scholar who was with him, said, that's a lot. Okay, so what Voltaire is basically saying is the other playwrights in France beside himself, they stink. Okay, Voltaire continues. The mediocre writer, what a tedious mortal. How assiduously he tells you what everybody knows. How ponderously he discusses that which is not worth being noted lightly. And that's like Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer says the characteristic, of a great writer is that he only says what needs to be said, neither more nor less. Voltaire, to be good, a play should be new without being bizarre. It should be sublime but natural. It should know the human heart and make it speak. It should have some poetry. Okay. Next quote by Voltaire. Princes who criticize flattery are as rare as popes who criticize infallibility. Voltaire. The Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And then here's Voltaire on women. He says, very learned women are to be found in the same manner as female warriors, but they are seldom or never inventors. In general, up until modern times, 1960s and afterwards, women had 10 or 15 children, so they didn't have much time to do academic, creative, or scientific work. It's just a fact. And even now, as they do more scientific work, women have great memories. They can do fantastic in school, but women tend to be very conformist in comparison with men. I think women are much more afraid than men are of being cast out of the social order. And because of that, they don't do as much original stuff. They just don't. I know a bunch of girls. I know 3 girls who all graduated second in their medical school class, and I know them quite well. Not a single one of them had any ambition other than, be good at their job, make money, have a nice life in a wealthy suburb. Whereas, I was off the charts ambitious, as were some of my other male friends. Okay, they just, my wife yelled at me one time when I was preparing for this big lecture that was important to me. And she's like, you're such a typical man, always trying to show off and be a big shot. Women don't care. Women just want to survive. They don't care about showing off. Okay, and also a lot of these women are pretty, and if you're a pretty woman, you're pretty much set for life. You don't really need to do anything. You get affirmative action for your whole life. Okay, Voltaire. Liberty of thought is the life of the soul. Why do animals have brains but plants do not? Because animals move. The other thing I've noticed is beautiful women, like some of the ones I've been involved with, they have a very optimistic perspective on life because they're always used to people being nice to them and men doing things for them. And that's another reason why I think they're not very good parents for boys, because boys, nobody likes boys. Nobody's going to help them the rest of their life. They have to learn how to do everything for themselves. And if they grow up with this mommy telling them, you're the most wonderful boy in the world, they get an unrealistic sense of what they need to do in life. They can't understand why nobody cares about helping them or liking them, because that's just how it is for men. Okay, Voltaire. Liberty of thought is the life of the soul. Why do animals have brains but plants do not? Because animals move. Yeah, our brains are made to help us with motion. When the masses get involved in reasoning, everything is lost. Interviewer asks Voltaire, how come no woman has ever written a great tragedy? Voltaire's response, the composition of tragedy requires testicles. Okay, Voltaire, the only reward to be expected from literature is contempt if one fails and hatred if one succeeds. Okay, now I'm going to give you a quote by Will Durant, the great philosopher who just loved Voltaire. He thought Voltaire was the greatest writer who ever lived. So Will Durant said, Voltaire's energy came out through his pen. Okay, the Jesuits, they dominated education in France until 1761, and then Madame Pompadour schemed to get them thrown out of France, and Voltaire helped them. And like the Brits were cruel to the Roman Catholic Church, the French were cruel to the Protestants. Voltaire's quote to somebody who stayed too long in his house, he said, to the guest who had overstayed at his house, he said, how are you different from Don Quixote? He mistook an inn for a house, and you have mistook a house for an inn. Okay, and then when he was in England, an angry mob wanted to beat him up of Englishmen. And he said, Englishman, you want to kill me because I am a Frenchman? Am I not punished enough in not being an Englishman? And the crowd thought that was funny, and they were nice to him at that point. All right, that's all I got for Voltaire. I hope you found that helpful.